I'm Ronald Atlas. I'm a member of the Symposium Planning Committee, and for the last session of the day, we continue our discussion of the risk factors, but this time we're going to look specifically at the biosecurity issues surrounding gain-of-function research. I have three colleagues who are going to address the issue, starting with Greg Koblentz, who's going to deal with, I believe, some of the general issues, and then we're going to move to some more specific areas of concern. So, Greg, if you would lead us off, please.
Okay, great. Thank you. So as part of this panel on the risks of misuse, I'm going to focus on one particular type of misuse, which is the acquisition of biological weapons by malicious non-state actors, and in this case, terrorists. There are other risks, but I will leave those for another time. And just before I start, I just want to note there's some interesting parallels I think you'll see when I talk about the debate about bioterrorism, some interesting parallels with the debate we're having about the risks of gain-of-function research also. This all really started back in 1995 when there were three high-profile incidents that have launched what's now a 20-year debate on the risks of terrorists acquiring and using biological weapons. The first was the sarin attack in the Tokyo subway system in March of 1995 by the Aum Shinrikyo cult in Japan, followed less than 1 month later by the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, which was the worst case of domestic terrorism in the US at that time. And less than 1 month after that, Larry Wayne Harris, who was a white supremacist living in Ohio, was arrested for trying to acquire Yersinia pestis through the mail. The combination of these three events, even though they're all unrelated, because they happened in such a short span of time, triggered a debate on the risks of bioterrorism that we are still debating today. Before I get into the details of that debate, I just want to make sure we're all speaking the same language. And there have been a couple of previous slides that talk about what is risk, but I just want to go over the way I think about risk. Risk assessments are probabilistic judgments about the likelihood that a particular type of event will occur and the consequences of that event. When people look at terrorism and assess the risk of terrorism, they typically look at three components. What is the threat, which is a function of both the capability of a terrorist group and its intent to attack a certain target or use a certain type of weapon? What is the vulnerability of a target to an attack? And what would be the consequences of a successful attack minus whatever countermeasures you have in place to mitigate the effects? This same kind of very basic formula can be used for a wide range of risks, but the framework I'm using in this context is for terrorism. A comprehensive risk assessment needs to look at all three components. Looking at just one piece of this is not a risk assessment. So you need to look at all three, which is a key feature. Now, one of the similarities between this debate and that on gain of function is that the good news is that we don't have a lot of good data. There have been probably as many flu pandemics in the last 100 years as there have been cases of major bioterrorism incidents. So the good news is we have very little data. The bad news is this gives us a lot of room for speculation. There's a lot of uncertainty. And so this debate has evolved over time into three very distinct schools of thought or camps about the nature of the threat. And I'll just note up front that these three schools of thought are not associated with any one individual, any one organization. These are ideal type constructs, but they do set the parameters for the nature of the debate that we've been having over the last 20 years. The first group are the optimists. They generally look at the risk of bioterrorism as being greatly exaggerated. At worst, they are a weapon of mass disruption, not a weapon of mass destruction. And they base this assessment on several factors. First, incidents of bioterrorism have been extremely rare. Compared to the number of terrorist attacks overall, there have been a minuscule number of attempts by terrorists to actually acquire and use biological weapons. And for optimists, these events have been rare for good reason, and these reasons are still with us today. Terrorists simply don't want or need these weapons to achieve their goals. On the one hand, terrorists tend to be actually very conservative. They like to stick with what works. This is why most terrorist attacks involve guns and bombs. They have a proven track record, they're easy to acquire, they're easy to use, and they have the dramatic effect that is desired. Secondly, terrorists simply don't want these weapons. There is a norm, a stigma against the use of disease as a weapon that has served as an obstacle or constraint on groups from acquiring these weapons in the past. Even though lots of groups might have been capable of going down this road, they haven't. And this is simply out of a lack of desire. In addition, the technical hurdles for bioterrorism are much higher than conventional wisdom or Hollywood movies or popular thrillers would suggest they are. You can't go into your backyard, dig up some anthrax, put in some test tubes in your bathtub, and use a recipe downloaded from the internet to make a biological weapon. Even if the equipment itself is dual use, there's a certain set of skills that are needed to convert an organism into a weapon, and these skills are rather esoteric, and they require, for example, lots of tacit knowledge. Knowledge that is learned through hands-on training, trial and error experience, mentoring, apprenticeship in a laboratory. You can't download a recipe off the internet and instantly create a mass casualty biological weapon. So there are both material and skill-based obstacles that are very problematic. Now, the pessimists think that bioterrorism is a matter of when, not if. And when it happens, the consequences will be catastrophic. And the pessimists look at the history of bioterrorism differently than the optimists. They see the small number of cases of groups actually trying to acquire these weapons as being harbingers of the future of bioterrorism, that these are acts that demonstrate that terrorists actually are innovative, that they're not purely conservative organizations that are averse to failure, but actually they will take risks and experiment with new ways of causing death and terrorism. And one of the motivations for innovating in this direction is that terrorist groups have become more lethal over time. And there's actually good data to show this in terms of the volume and the lethality of attacks has been growing over time. And one of the key characteristics that has been driving this phenomenon is the rise of religiously motivated terrorist groups, which tend to show less constraints about causing mass casualties, because when you look at conflict as a divine or sacred duty and not as a political act, it removes some of the normal constraints that secular, ethno-nationalist, or ideologically motivated terrorists have shown in the past. In addition, pessimists look at advances in science and technology, the global diffusion of these technologies, as increasingly growing the ability of terrorist groups. Groups are becoming more capable over time, and this gives them increased access to means that they did not have previously. So these technical hurdles are falling. Specifically, the role of tacit knowledge becomes less important when more advanced experiments or research methods or production techniques become automated, they become black boxed or generally de-skilled, and so you need less tacit knowledge, less highly skilled individuals conduct the work now that maybe would have required someone with PhD training and years of experience 10 or 15 years ago. And finally, pessimists focus a good deal on also the consequences of an attack as well as the vulnerability of society to attacks as well. And so that increases the level of risk that they see. Finally, the last group are the pragmatists. For pragmatists, bioterrorism is a low probability, low consequence event. Like the pessimists, pragmatists worry that about the emergence of terrorist groups that have both the intent and capability to acquire biological weapons, but they view groups emerging with this combination of characteristics as being very rare. And the magnitude of an attack by one of these groups would actually be on the lower end. So pragmatists pay less attention to vulnerability and consequences and more about understanding how and why terrorist groups pursue this form of weapons. Instead of looking at historical data the way the optimists do and say that the past is a predictor of the future, instead of looking at the way that the pessimists do, and they try and project the implications of long-term trends, pragmatists try and focus on what are the conditions or variables that have led certain groups to try and acquire these types of weapons and not others. And this means you do a lot of kind of case study, in-depth analysis, which can be very revealing about individual groups, but the downside is it's very hard to generalize about overall risk levels when you're looking at just a handful of very idiosyncratic groups or individuals. But it does highlight also the dynamic nature of this threat, There's not a static threat that you can point to at one time, this is the way it is, this is the way it will always be, because changes in a group's internal structure, their leadership, their external environment can change the likelihood that they'll try and pursue a biological weapon. Finally, the pragmatists share the pessimist view on the growing capability of these groups in terms of their ability to acquire material or resources, but at the same time they share the optimist's perspective on the fact that there is a lot more that goes into building one of these weapons or using this research than just the material dual-use equipment, that the skills and knowledge is also extremely important, and this is the soft side of the risk assessment, looking at socio-technical factors, organizational factors, leadership, ideology is all playing an important role. And what that means is that the aspirations of terrorist groups will almost always exceed their actual operational capabilities. So they might have the intent to acquire something that could be very catastrophic, but the record shows so far that they will, their reach will exceed their grasp, and they will only be able to accomplish small-scale attacks. So let me bring this back to the debate that we're having today, and what this means for dual-use research. And I think part of the debate about the risks that people perceive from this research is partly correlated to what is the risk that you think this research will be misused. So looking at the likelihood of different types of groups or individuals misusing this research. And so there are three factors that I just want to highlight as being correlated with these different schools of thought. One is, what is the actual quote-unquote demand by terrorists for this kind of knowledge or this kind of material? And again, the optimists and pessimists and pragmatists will have different perspectives. But I think that there's a case to be made that there needs to be a separation of looking at the knowledge generated versus the technologies. And the technologies are much more applicable to a weapon as opposed to knowledge, which requires many, many steps and a lot more resources to convert it into something that actually could cause harm to others. And so this gets at how easy is it to translate research into a viable weapon, right? What else is required aside from just an article or a method section that an organization or a individual needs to actually convert that into something that's able to cause harm. And then finally, how do you weigh the benefits and risks? And I know that there will be a large effort to try and quantify these two categories. We'll be able to do some of that. Much of this will be unquantifiable. It'll be qualitative data. And at the end of the day, there will be some value judgments that have to be made about how much do we benefit, how much do we value the benefits this brings us in terms of being able to predict pandemics or have flu vaccine stockpiles versus the risk that this research will be misused in the future. And so depending where you fall on the spectrum of looking at the risk of malicious misuse, this leads you probably to weight the benefits or the risks differently. And this might not be explicit, this might be objective, this might not be quantifiable, but will nonetheless find its way in the risk assessment process. So I think it's worth surfacing those assumptions early on rather than letting them be buried. So, thank you.
Great.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present a few points for your consideration about the biosecurity risks of gain-of-function research. I have 6 points and no slides. So the first point is that there are few true surprises in bioscience research that affect security. Science, as you know, is incremental and it's just in discovery, and there's usually not, as such, there's not a clear dividing line in experimentation when things usually become problematic from a security standpoint. In the case of influenza, my understanding is that there's a long history of experimentation and publications describing specific mutations associated with increased pathogenicity, increased transmissibility. And while 1 or 2 papers may be problematic, especially problematic, NSAB certainly thought so in 2011, the information that could be misused was considered by many to be already out there. That being said, on the other hand, it can't be denied that publishing the sequences of new potentially pandemic-causing strains of anything does lower barriers to its weaponization. So that even though a lot of information is out there that could be misused, by having the sequence available, you are making it easier to skip steps that might be technically challenging. My third point is that while this is the case, flu, SARS, and MERS join a whole host of many other pathogens which can be misused. There are many experimental alterations of disease agents that also have the potential to be used as weapons, and many of these examples have been published in the scientific literature. For example, one paper that comes to mind is a 1997 paper that described how anthrax could be modified to evade its vaccine. There was a very famous 2001 paper that described how if you inferred from their model that there could be a potential that smallpox could be modified to evade its vaccine. And there are many, many descriptions of how bacterial pathogens could be made antibiotic resistant. So there's all of these experimentally altered pathogens that are described in the literature, joining a whole host of pathogens that are not altered, that are currently making people sick, animals sick, and could be found in the natural world. The bottom line here is that there are many, many, many pathogens that could be misused by somebody who wants to misuse them. My fourth point is, with this plethora of possible pathogens that are available for misuse, there are many paths that can be taken towards weaponization that do not require quite as much R&D as misusing gain-of-function influenza, SARS, or MERS would. Thankfully, as Dr. Koblentz has described, making a biological weapon is more than just pathogen acquisition. And there is the question of how you would disseminate it, how you would get sufficient quantities, and also it's about what kind of effect you would cause. And all of the work that's being discussed here today is legitimately performed in scientific laboratories with oversight and in animal models when available. And as we know, there's some animal models don't necessarily reflect the human experience. And so there are just lots of other options that would be available that have documented effects in real people that would reduce some of the guesswork involved in choosing one of these pathogens as a weapon. So my next point concerns who would be misusing this type of research. It's difficult to assess the risks of misuse of research without also focusing on what particular actor would be misusing it. And in addition to a non-state actor group, you would have concerns about state actors or even individuals, and not to mention differing assessments on their level of capability to perform, to make a biological weapon. And there have been reports, I'm sure you've seen in the newspaper, of ISIS having interests in biological weapons and other non-state actor groups. And there are many indicators that over the course of 10 years, or at least pessimists are indicating that that our risks of this being a problem are only going to increase. But because there aren't so many there thankfully are not frequent biological weapons attacks, we are going to be basing a lot of our risk assessments on expert opinion. And as was just described, and I can confirm, there is a wide range of opinions on what the biological weapons threat is. We are just wrapping up a Delphi study with colleagues at START at University of Maryland, and looking at polling 60 people in the biosecurity community about their thoughts of the future of biological weapons development and use. And really the results are remarkable for their lack of consensus. and where people see the biggest threats, whether they come from an insider threat, a group of technically capable non-state actors, people who can purchase such expertise, to to just the state programs, of which there are a few. So there's really no consensus, so that's going to be a challenge for risk assessment. My sixth point is that assessing the security impact of gain-of-function research really also needs to be placed into context, not just the context of risk, but also the context of benefit. And if gain-of-function research were determined by the risk assessment groups that are looking at this, the committees that are looking at this, that it has the potential to lead to a vaccine or to other positive outcomes, that would be a security benefit as well. So, in summary, there are lots of complexities in assessing how gain-of-function work and other dual-use research of concern work might lower barriers to biological weapons development. And really, every single case of DIRC is different with its own scientific particulars. But the line between that and actual misuse is quite murky. And I just would hope that the committee will be placing emphasis on the need to perform good and safe science, which increases our understanding of the natural world and our ability to fight disease, because the link between that kind of research and a positive security benefit is much more clear.
Carol.
Well, thank you. I stand between you all and getting on the metro or to the bar or to dinner. So I'm going to keep my remarks brief. I want to acknowledge my colleagues' comments, and I want to shift my focus a little bit more back to public health and biosecurity in general. And in my mind, since I don't work with flu, MERS, or SARS on a daily basis, or ever for that matter, in my mind, I sort of plug in gain-of-function research with those three organisms with almost interchangeably with hazardous microorganisms, and the sort of general framework of thinking about these issues that has evolved, at least within the U.S. government, over the past couple of decades. So, taking a step back to what I think we were asked to do, or what I thought I was asked to do, biosecurity, what is it? It's the protection of hazardous biological agents, and here you can substitute gain-of-function research for flu, SARS, or MERS, from loss, theft, or diversion, or intentional misuse. Now, Dr. Koblentz and Dr. Gronvall have just talked more about the intentional misuse part, but in reality, I want to focus more on the health or public health aspect of this, because at the end of the day, I think what we're all really talking about is preventing the people who work with these things in the laboratory from catching their experiments, and protecting or preventing people and animals outside of the laboratory environment from catching these experiments. I mean, I think that's really what everybody is so concerned about. So how do we achieve biosecurity? I've been on a number, I don't even want to count them all, of working groups discussing how to enhance biosafety and biosecurity and what we can do at the federal level. I want to also note that biosecurity and biosafety, in my mind, are inextricably linked. And several years ago, I think I made a statement in a meeting that said, well, it's all captured in biosafety. If you just read all the policy documents and the BMBL guidelines, I thought that biosafety was adequately captured in there, but apparently other folks didn't. So we have evolved a pretty robust discussion over the past number of years about specifically biosecurity, and over and over again, and Dr. Atlas, I think, is one of the proponents of this, what we always end up circling back to in every single discussion is the culture of responsibility in the sciences, and how this boils down to not only individual responsibility of the researchers and the folks working in the lab, but the institutional responsibilities, which we heard about in detail on the previous panel, And then at higher levels, what are our national policies and regulations? So we've attempted to enhance and achieve biosecurity through a combination of practices, through education and training, through doing security risk assessments, which are prescribed or guidance is provided in the Select Agent Program, through personnel reliability, enhancing our confidence such as best we can that the people who are working in the laboratory, in containment, with pathogens, doing studies that might generate a pathogen that has properties that really require management and risk reduction, that we have a high degree of confidence that that person or that individual is not going to do something with malintent with what they're working with. All of these laboratories have pretty stringent physical security requirements to prevent unauthorized access to materials so that people can't just wander in and take a strain out of the lab back to their basement or their kitchen or their private laboratory. And we've also, for many, many, many years, regulated the transportation of these things. And I think we heard from Phil Dormitzer earlier about how maybe some of these regulations have actually had unintended consequences. So we've heard quite a bit now about the sort of terrorism, biowarfare risks, but really there's a spectrum of risk associated with any of this work, and I say that in general terms, with pathogens, with gain of function, with any of the high consequence pathogens. And those are the concern about accidents, which we've heard about, and you can run numbers and do risk calculations based on those assumptions. Insider threat and sabotage, we've certainly seen an example of that in 2001. Something that doesn't necessarily always occur in the academic community, but I think is more prevalent as an awareness in the industry is intellectual property theft and espionage. I mean, that's a concern in certain sectors. And then, of course, there's terrorism and deliberate criminal misuse of these materials. So I'll just wrap it up by saying I think I'm probably fall into Greg's category of pragmatist. I think we need to put in place measured, reasonable approaches, recognizing that I don't think we can ever reduce risk to zero, but I'd like to think that by putting in place layered approaches to biosecurity and biosafety, when you multiply out all of those risk reductions, you asymptotically approach zero by pushing that number way out to the right of the decimal point. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. And we have a question from Kavita Berger via the web. And Kavita says, the security aspects of gain of function is concerned with someone who wants to use the information gained or viruses created to cause harm. How should risk assessments take into account the capabilities, skills, knowledge, and expertise of people who intend to do harm? If scientists are asked to conduct the risk assessments, how should they account for these issues, especially when they do not have information about the people or groups who want to cause harm? So, what are the security risks when you don't know the people, they want to do harm, and where it is the knowledge base or the viruses that are getting out?
That goes to the public, essentially the information security risk, the publication issue. I don't know, Gigi, do you want to comment on that?
I mean, there are definitely risks. I think the risks are greater from not publishing because then that information can't be used. But I mean, it does lower barriers to misuse. It definitely does.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of how do you do a risk assessment, it's not just the job of the scientific community because they don't have necessarily the requisite knowledge about the nature of threats in terms of intentions of groups, capabilities of groups. So it needs to be a joint effort. You need to have both the scientists who understand the research. You need to have people from the security community who understand the nature of the threats out there, and that's how you do a comprehensive risk assessment. It has to be multidisciplinary, and I think that's the key to moving forward. It's not all on the shoulders of one group or another, but it needs to be a collaborative effort.
Gigi, during your talk, one of the things you mentioned was the risk of publishing sequences, and that often is raised and certainly came up during the initial debate about the H5N1 influenza. I want to flip the question and ask, what is the risk of not publishing sequences?
Well, I think getting to some biosafety concerns, the risk is that somebody else will, if you think that the risk, the work to generate that sequence would involve work that could potentially, that people need to be cautious and have stringent biosafety standards, if they were to repeat that, then that would be, I mean, it would be repeated. If you said, we have a sequence, we've sequenced this, but it's too dangerous for you to share, then somebody would redo that work. So I guess I see it from pragmatically, like there's no point in withholding the sequence. And secondly, it wouldn't be able to be used. And thirdly, the work would be done again to, which could have safety concerns.
Carol, you want to jump?
Well, I'm not sure how sequence information is controlled because I don't work in that arena, but I know, for example, there was an initiative a couple of years ago among the synthetic DNA companies to make sure that when people ordered sequences that they were essentially vetted customers, much like ATCC and other culture collections put in place policies for, after Larry Wayne Harris, put in place policies for only providing, biological materials, biological agents to essentially vetted recipients. So I don't know how access to those sequence databases is controlled because I'm just ignorant about it, but it seems to me that, I mean, that's one way of sharing sequence information is to, at least on the first pass, ensure to the extent that you can that it's legitimate users, essentially professional scientists who are gaining access to the information. But I know that that's probably not the case. But
I just want to add, in 1994, when Venter published the sequence of smallpox, at that time there was not really the capabilities to read DNA were there more than the capabilities to write it. But the concern did come up, and at least he was surprised that they allowed him to publish it. But the argument at that time was that it was public research. It was funded by the public, and it belonged to the public, and the information in that was useful for many other scientific experiments. So, and that's freely accessible.
All right, let me turn to the question. We've got a longer line on this side, so I'll start here.
Thank you. I'm Jim Welch of the Elizabeth Griffin Foundation, and my question has to do more with, I'm going to preface this by saying I'm probably an optimist when it comes to terrorists. I'm probably a pragmatist when it comes to nation states. And I love the University of Wisconsin. My daughter got her PhD there, who could not love Liney's and brats and cheese curds. So I trust the University of Wisconsin. There are nation states that I, quite honestly, don't trust with the same degree that I trust the University of Wisconsin. And if those nation states were involved in government-funded research at universities within their countries having to do with this particular type of research, how would I see it?
Well, I can't tell you how you see it, but there is a similar level of debate about states. I mean, there's a different logic in terms of the resources that states have, the motivations for them acquiring biological weapon capabilities, the likelihood they would use it. So there's a different logic, but you can take the same kind of outline of the debate and look at the number of states that have sought biological weapons is very small, historically speaking. Most of those states have abandoned these weapons over time. So that's the optimist view. For the pessimists, right, they focus on the fact that these weapons provide an asymmetric capability that smaller states, weaker states, so-called rogue states have a incentive to acquire this capability because it can be so consequential. You know, looking at again, our full risk assessment needs to take into account all of the spectrum of biosecurity threats, whether it's from you know, insiders or terrorists or states. You need to take all those into account. But there are different logics driving these different actors that's worth kind of exploring more in this process.
On the left.
Gerry Epstein at the Department of Homeland Security. I wanted to pick up on Kavita Berger's question about how can the scientific community have awareness of this wealth of information that they may need to know to make security judgments. And I guess what I'd like to respond to that is the role of the security community, I think, in this discussion is not to provide specific information that they may or may not know, but to provide a perspective that this is a threat, a risk that one needs to be taken seriously. Because one can never hope to assume that one had all the information anyway in any collection. One would always have to worry that the group that may be misusing information doesn't yet exist or may be completely unknown to anybody. And so I think the idea that there's specific information that the scientific community doesn't have and is therefore hampering them is really the wrong way to look at it. I think what one needs to do is recognize that this is a set of concerns that, although it may be very difficult to quantify, has to be considered, and that approach has to be one that a risk that is taken into account, as opposed to saying, yeah, if we only knew about that person in that room, we'd make a better decision.
Just to comment on that, Gerry, as you wrote, you know, this leads to why it's very important for scientists to be aware of the threat of different threats of their work. But you know, if a scientist is asked after if there was a misuse, they should never be saying like, "Oh, it never occurred to me." But there is a limit to what you can do.
Nicholas Evans from the University of Pennsylvania. So a lot of this discussion in this instance of the dual-use debate, this time around as it were, has focused primarily on biosafety, and this is one of the first forays that we're making today into biosecurity. As the NSABB moves forward through the deliberative process, and as the NAS moves forward through the deliberative process, what role do you see biosecurity considerations taking in this in the conceptual framework behind the risk-benefit analysis? Because it isn't clear that the risk-benefit analysis is meant to be more than biosafety, but it evidently seems like it should play that biosecurity should play some role in this.
Like that. I think it should play a role, and as I said, I think biosecurity and biosafety are inextricably linked. And Ed Yu, who's standing right behind you, has done a lot of work on biosecurity and worked with the academic community for the past several years to put in place some programs and efforts to enhance biosecurity awareness. Again, it involves basically educating people at the level of the individuals who work in the laboratory as to what the issues are, what their role in safe conduct of research is, what their role is in making sure that somebody doesn't do something malintentioned with the materials from that laboratory. So I think it's an important piece of the risk-benefit analysis. And taking a step back again, there's something that has been emerging over the past couple of years in both national and international discussions, especially in the European community, of the overall picture of bio-risk management, which is the multifactorial approach incorporating both biosafety, biosecurity, personnel reliability, and all of the associated guidelines that go with that, and takes a much more integrated approach to the whole problem of assuring essentially the safe conduct of research in the laboratory.
Giorgio Palù, Padua University, Italy, and European Society for Virology. Let's try to be provocative here, because for the sake of the discussion, actually, we are, defining risk-benefit, and here we are in the session of biosecurity, and I accept that the term will merge with biosafety, because it will cover not only an intentional threat to humankind, to environment, to agriculture, but could be also misapplication. So it may merge very well. But okay, when we speak about, today, we don't want to make SARS more virulent. We never will use Ebola to make airborne diffusible. But in a sense, the perspective, we suffer from relativism because the perspective may vary according to the player. We are scientists here, so our benefit is to pursue research and the truth. But if you are an industry, like my friend Rino Rappuoli will pursue stockpiling, revenue, or margin. If you are a biodefense apparatus, and here is an example, maybe what is not ethical, because we discuss ethical principle here, risk and benefit evaluation, either to respect Nuremberg Code, an Helsinki Declaration, or even to be adherent to an Hippocratic Oath. But if you are a biodefense apparatus and you know that your opponent, we are not talking about ISIS in Middle East or Australia today, by, let's say, the former Soviet Union, has weaponized Ebola virus. So wouldn't you allow legal for you to try to make the same experiment? And that will be even ethical acceptable. So I think, we have to consider when we talk risk-benefit, maybe tomorrow morning, but I would like to hear, because what is the situation with Ebola in another, let's say, site, biodefense?
I would think the biodefense falls under the same rubric of dual-use research of concern, and the U.S. government has the same policy for the biodefense side, the military research at USAMRIID, as NIH, in terms of not doing certain sets of experiments that could be problematic. On top of that, we have the Biological Weapons Convention, which makes it illegal to try and even develop, produce, acquire a biological weapon. So the policies that are being put in place are applicable to both industry, academia, and government. They're not discriminatory in that way, and I think that's the right thing. You want to have a level playing field in that context. So I don't think you need to make the distinction between the ultimate purpose. It's the type of experiment being done that matters, and that's what's, I think, rightly the focus of NSABB and NIS in terms of looking at the types of experiments being done and what are their inherent risks or benefits to both your country and internationally.
Good afternoon. Ed Yu from the FBI Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate. Thank you for your presentations. I have more of a comment, and it's coming at the end of the day. There was, I'll talk throughout the day about risk-benefit assessment, calculus, and one of the, I guess, key variables that has not been mentioned up until now is that a lot of the assessments have been very much focused on the agents, which is understandable considering the current policy, and then very much performance-based. One aspect, especially when it comes to security, there was talk about the BMBL and other aspects, but it wasn't until now that things have mentioned like the Biological Weapons Convention or even the history of the Select Agent Program, that how it came to be was born out of a security incident, not out of a safety issue. And things like the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Criminal Statutes, which the FBI is charged to enforce. And it really all boils down to looking at intent. And that's really the true challenge, is looking at it from beneficial, legitimate intent versus illegitimate malintent. And that's the one part of the variable that oftentimes that we've seen when we do our engagement with the scientific community, that they're doing their best effort, their due diligence to look at the appropriate assessments, but they've never been educated really about what the security incidents have been that have fostered the generation of things like the Biological Weapons Convention. And that goes towards answering Dr. Welch's question about the state aspect, is that although we may not know exactly specifically what's happening in the states, we do have the Biological Weapons Convention. There's a reason why it came into being. And that's just one example of some of the factors that don't get factored into the discussions about what the assessments are. And you really, and this goes to Dr. Kavita Berger's comment, is that you really won't get to that full assessment unless you have the right players in the discussion. So you need the scientific community, you need the appropriate security representatives, and this also brings up the other comment, is that there has been already talk about proper reporting findings, about incidents. One other thing that's been sort of lacking is reporting of best practices. things such as the things that have been taking place at the University of Wisconsin in their biosecurity task force, at the local level, as the institutional level, there have been some maybe very robust practices that put into place that addresses all these different facets that I just mentioned, but there's no vehicle to share that kind of our processes and activities to make it more broader based and better understood. And then finally, just as a personal note, during a lunch conversation, one interesting aspect is that when the FBI agents go through their new agent academy, their training culminates in a moot court setting. So you're trained in a defense attorney cross-examination or being able to articulate your position in an investigation. It came to mind that if you have the right conversation pieces in place in the training of a student or a postdoc or a faculty member, it would be nice to see something like a moot IBC proceedings, so that when you have these type of projects or proposals in place, or even a journal club setting, that you have this type of discussion so that when they're submitting these aspects of research proposals to the process, it's not so opaque, and that you now have a robust discussion at the front end very early on in the training regimen and what some of the questions can be, not only from an integrity and performance position of the merit of a research project, but also to address some of the safety and security considerations that were discussed today. So I apologize for the comments being a little long-winded, but just wanted to factor that in.
Thank you for the comments, Ed. I think they were very on point.
Türkan Gardner, statistician. When I heard Dr. Linden mention the public health aspects, I was reminded of a very detailed and extensive article that appeared in Science a couple of years ago. And it involved not only analysis, but also visual display. It had world maps with different countries, an epidemic starting in a certain location, and traveling to different parts of the world. And in the charts, 4 colors were represented. Probability of 0, low probability, an intermediate probability, as well as time for the epidemic to get there. And to me, it seemed like almost surreal. There was too much information, and but I was interested to see what models they used, and there was some validation in there, tracking the predictions to actual occurrence of the event. And it was fascinating. It involved multiple media for displaying time-space relationships. And I wish I could find the article because it represented how complicated models could get in terms of disease spread. And it also reminded me of some work that I did for relating to air pollution models from stationary sources. And there, the variables that were under consideration were wind speed, wind direction, distance, terrain, and of course with epidemics we have multi-factorial aspects to consider. So I thank you very much for the wonderful presentations and also consideration of the importance of time, space, and geographical orientation to modeling disease data. Thank you.
Well, no doubt somebody has probably done a model or modeling effort on, maybe they haven't. Maybe that's something that might be informative to actually model, one of these scenarios where, you take an event in a laboratory and see what happens and, factor in all the mitigation measures that would be applied and so forth. So I don't know if that's been done.
This was multi-collaborative work from a number of universities around the world.
Well, certainly there's been a ton of epidemiological modeling in general, but I'm bringing it back specifically to this discussion of gain of function, I don't know if anybody has done any specific modeling of what the questions are or the things that lurk in the unsaid in the back of our minds, that what we're really concerned about.
Okay. My name is Koos van der Brugge, Royal Academy of Arts and Sciences in the Netherlands. First, an observation. I think that the debate on this gain of function research has made a shift since it started in 2011 until now, from real biosecurity issues to more biosafety issues. See the agenda of today, and also the meeting in Hanover was proof of this. Back to biosecurity, because I don't know if the shift to biosafety has made it easier. I think that threats are even more difficult to determine than biosafety risks. See the illustration by Dr. Koblentz with optimists, pessimists, and pragmatists, or realists. I don't know if that's the same. And I think pessimists surely must be security experts, thinking in worst case scenarios always. But the point is how to deal with these issues. And then I'll go back to the start of the debate, the debate about the publication or not publication of the both articles of Fouché and Kawaoka. In the Netherlands, this debate was even more complicated because after the approval of by NSABB, Erasmus Medical Center and Fouché had to ask for an expert license to publish their article in Science. This license was given, but there's still a court procedure on the principle of if this was a justified decision. For the Dutch Ministry of Science and also for the Academy, this was reason to ask the question how to deal with these dual-use research in a way that does not have to be fought at court. And we published 1 year ago now an advice report in which we did some suggestions to support the scientists who are possibly doing dual-use research to make the right decisions, and so in this way to prevent that it had to come to the judge. We're still waiting on a decision of our government if they apply this advice in their policy, but we're waiting for it. But the main point is how to deal with it without going to too rigorous measures. Okay.
I think you're absolutely correct that the NSAB 2 years ago or 3 years ago, when they first brought the term gain of function into use, their concerns were about biosecurity, and the conversation definitely has shifted. And I think that safety is easier to quantify than security in this context. And so while risk assessment on that score will be challenging, I think the security dimension is much more challenging.
I have a question for the panel. One of the things that the organizing committee has tried to ensure is that we discuss the differences between MERS and SARS and influenza viruses. When it comes to the biosecurity side of risk, we have some influenza viruses, the high-path avian ones, that are select agents, others are not. We have SARS as a select agent, MERS that is not. What are your thoughts about the security issues surrounding those differences, let us say, between MERS and SARS, or high-path avian influenza and the rest of the influenza viruses, from a biosecurity risk perspective, because that is this panel, and you are the experts.
I'll take an initial stab at that. Purely from a security perspective, you'd have to look at how accessible are these different pathogens. And this is to make a point that Gigi made, is that the pathogens are necessary but not sufficient, right? There's a lot more that goes into creating a weapon than just having the actual organism. But right, if SARS does not exist in nature or is not really accessible in nature, then you're looking at how many laboratories have it, where are the laboratories, what are the security measures like. So for SARS, maybe that's easier than looking at MERS, which is still happening in the wild. It's happening prominently in the Middle East, where we know there are groups that are actively, interested in these types of weapons. So that would, in theory, make that more worrisome. On the other hand, there's no case of a terrorist group ever acquiring a virulent agent from nature. All the cases that we have where groups have acquired a virulent pathogen for use as a weapon has been from a laboratory, either through fraud or through theft or through diversion. So you have to take into account what have groups done historically, and then where are these pathogens currently available. That you'd have to look at that in the risk assessment. But it's somewhat unfair to single out MERS and SARS and flu in this context, given that there are, a dozen Tier 1 agents on the DHS list. There are even more on the select agent list. So doing a flu, SARS, MERS specific analysis, I think, would be misleading, given that they're part of just a much wider array of agents of concern. So that would be something to keep in mind as well.
I have the same kind of approach in thinking about this to Greg's, because as I said at the beginning of my talk, I don't really view these as a unique problem. I put them in the context of hazardous biological agents that require containment and good biosafety and biosecurity to make sure you don't catch your experiment, basically. So, I don't really see them as meriting different or special biosecurity measures, and I don't necessarily see them as that different from each other in the context of the laboratory. Going back to what Greg says, I mean, maybe you could find high-path avian influenza, in Asia if you knew where to go and you knew where there were outbreaks and some flocks, and you could get it. I think MERS is too unpredictable in terms of its ecology and the epidemic that's going on in the Middle East. And then the coronavirus, SARS, is not readily available in a naturally occurring kind of sense. So, I think really we're kind of concerned about handling these agents in the laboratory, and then you just jump right back into, what are the appropriate biosafety and biosecurity measures for handling the level of essentially scientific and medical risk associated with working with these things.
Right. Last question coming here.
Okay, thank you. I try to be short.
Wait, we've got another one too, but let's take the right first and then Ed.
Okay. My question relates to the dynamic nature of the risk perception in biosecurity. And the issue is we've seen now waves coming through the biosecurity where there were times where this was not an issue, and then there was a very important issue. We've seen 10 years ago part of the justification to go to war based in a biosecurity threat perception. We've seen 2 years ago the discussion of the NSABP focusing very strongly on the biosecurity element. We see here today that the biosecurity element is there, but it's not so important. It might be actually less important than the biosafety part. So when we talk about risk-benefit assessment and risk management, how do we handle this dynamic nature of threat perception in biosecurity?
That's a great question, because the assessment process, we try and be objective, but inherently it comes down to a lot of its perception. I know Dr. Fischoff is here, and he'll be talking tomorrow, and I think that'll be a very illuminating discussion. And partly, I think the focus, the shift to biosafety is in part because that is much more quantifiable, right? Dr. Lipschitz actually had real data, and there was lots of data collection efforts. With bioterrorism, that's just much harder. There's just much fewer data points, and so you can't do that depth of analysis and have a coherent, strong methodology. So there's kind of a methodological bias, I think, towards looking at biosafety versus biosecurity. I wouldn't say that the concern is any less real. I think it's changed. It has changed over time. In 2001, it was clearly focused on terrorist groups. 2003 is more states. In 2008, because of Ivans and Marithax, it was very much focused on the insider threat, which had really not gotten a lot of attention prior to that. So I think we have evolved over time a much fuller appreciation of the full range of biosecurity threats, just the same way we've evolved a much fuller appreciation of the biosafety risks, where even the CDC can fall victim to laboratory mishaps. So some things that kind of shake us out of our complacency that happen on a regular basis. So I think it's worth including all of these factors in the risk assessment process, and just being aware, going in eyes open, that a lot of this is not objective, a lot of it is not quantifiable, but as long as we are clear with our assumptions, the sources of our data, our methodologies, I think you can come up with a coherent, creditable risk assessment in the end.
That's part of the reason why I said that it's going to be challenging based on the range of how experts, people who have the same information about the very expansive Soviet program that continued long after it was internationally illegal, the fact that Shinrikyo had a biological weapons effort that wasn't detected until after the arrest for the sarin incident. I mean, there are lots of there are incidents, a lot of experts that know very much all about them, but they still lead them to different conclusions. Thankfully, we don't have so many incidents on a regular basis that we are all on the same page about that.
Last question.
Sure. Actually, this is in response to your question, Dr. Atlas, about an agent one being a select agent and the other one not being. This goes back to my prior comment about the importance of having an understanding of the different frameworks that address the security. So for in this instance, although it may not be, the select agent regulations may not cover one, I had cited the biological weapons anti-terrorism statutes. That's the U.S. Criminal Code, Title 18, Section 175, subparagraph A, and that's seared into my brain. But bottom line, it's basically looking at any biological agent, toxin, or delivery system for use as a weapon. And that really goes down to the heart, brass tacks of looking at intent. And so if you look at the letter of the law, it's irrespective of what agent it is. It doesn't have to be a select agent. It really does drill down and looking at the intent. And so that, in a way, serves as sort of a backstopping of the select agent regulations or any other potential misuse of a biological agent.
That's a very good point, because salmonella is not a select agent, but if you were to repeat an attack using salmonella, that would definitely be against the law.
Right.
Well, I want to thank the panel. I want to thank all the speakers who've had a say today, and all the people who've asked questions, both on the web and here. And Harvey, do you have any closing remarks? No? No more instructions other than we'll be back here first thing in the morning. Fran, you do. Okay. So. A quiet and attentive audience all day.
No, this is a logistical point. The organizing committee will gather for dinner at a restaurant called DC Commons, and it is on Washington Circle at 22nd Street. Am I getting that right, Jenna? Yes, okay, she's thumbs up. So if you walk up 23rd Street to the Circle and make a right, it's virtually right there. And the reservation is at 7 o'clock? Okay. So you have an entire hour and a half free.
All right. Again, thank you.